We're here. I'm Patrik Davitt from Baseball HQ and Baseball HQ Radio. Needs no introduction.
He's the skipper and I'm Gilligan.
Now, come on, little buddy. Do you have a copy of the book to show everybody?
Yes.
We're going to be talking about Ron's book, as you heard earlier today. 4 years in the making.
Yes.
167,000 words of clever prose. They cut it down to how much?
120. So yeah, there was 47,000 words that were cut, and I was just like, hey, I spent a lot of time writing those words. I don't want to lose them. And there were a lot of photographs too. You know, when I submitted the original manuscript, they said, you know, you're going to need to get permissions to use all these photos. And I said, I don't want to do that. So I took those outtakes and I put them together, and then Patrik here, with his marvelous design skills, put them into a PDF that are available on my website. So if you buy this book and you like it and you want to read some of the stories that were cut and see all those photos, they're at ronshandler.com/FantasyExpert. And they are there for you to, anyway. So
Yeah, I read them multiple times because we went through iterations. It's really interesting, and it's a shame a lot of it had to come out of the book because they're really quite good stories, and I've read the book as well in draft, and certainly that content was good content. The publisher
said no. Said we'll do this if it's down to 120,000 words. And you know, it's tough playing God with, you know, people and events and summarizing really good stories into a paragraph, but I think it still works. I think you'll still enjoy the book.
So why did you decide that you wanted to write a book 4 years ago and keep at it this long?
Yeah, I guess I've always had this idea of writing about the history of fantasy baseball, having essentially lived it. You know, I was in my first fantasy leagues in 1984, and the first edition of the Forecaster was 1986. And over time, I've just accumulated a lot of stuff. I'm a bit of an information hoarder, so if I saw an article I liked, I'd always clip it out, back in the days before the internet. And I thought one day I might do something like this, but never really had the opportunity, running a business and building this whole thing. But then the pandemic hit, and suddenly there was no baseball for 4 months, and I was like, all right, well, this will give me something to do. So I started it then, and from that point on, it's been a process, but here we are.
And before we go on, I thought I saw that Ray is back in. Can somebody go get us a couple of ferns?
Yeah. I knew we were missing something.
Well, I noticed that you decided that you were going to call the book a memoir rather than an autobiography, and I always wonder what's the difference between the two, and why did you choose memoir over autobiography?
Autobiography, the way I understand it, is basically writing about the entirety of my life, and this, I think, was just more of remembering the events in my business life. So there's a little bit of my personal life there, kind of sets a little bit of a tone at the beginning, kind of filters its way in and out every once in a while, but basically this is my career, and it's more of a memories about a certain portion of my life, and so I think that qualifies more as a memoir than a full autobiography.
And as you said, it's kind of a framing device to talk about the business of fantasy experthood and not just your part in it, because there's a lot of discussion of other experts that you've encountered along the way, and that makes it interesting, because it's, for anybody who's interested in this field, there's a lot of names that we're going to recognize in there, and we'll talk about them in a second. But I started playing fantasy sports in fantasy hockey. I'm Canadian, and that's, you know, a lot of Canadians.
Me too. My first fantasy sport was hockey too.
Oh, I thought you were saying me too. I'm Canadian.
Oh, no, I'm not Canadian.
This is news to me. So you're playing fantasy sports. You're enjoying it. So at what point do you decide I want to be a fantasy expert?
Well, nobody ever really decides that, do they? Oh, maybe some people do. For me, I came up through sabermetrics. Bill James just enthralled me with all his work, and as you'll read, you know, everybody reaches a certain point in their life where there's like a decision point where you can go in one direction or another. And for me, it was a visit to this bookstore in July 1984, where in the back of the discount rack, I found Bill James' 1994 abstract and the Rotisserie League Baseball book there together. And I bought them both, and basically my life changed after that. But as much as I got into sabermetrics with what Bill James was doing, there was a lot of other guys who were doing really good analysis work too. It was Pete Palmer and the Hidden Game of Baseball, and Thomas Boswell had this stat called total average. And I was wondering, who's the best? Everybody's into Bill James, but maybe these other gauges are pretty good too. So I had my Lotus 1, 2, 3 spreadsheet in 1986, and they said, well, let's see if I can just run all the player stats and have Bill James and Thomas Boswell and Pete Palmer side by side, and let's look at their metrics and see which ones I agree with more, which ones might provide more insight. And so I printed those up, and that basically became the first baseball forecaster. I figured, well, if I'm doing this, maybe others would be interested in this information as well.
So when you were looking at sabermetrics at that time, was it primarily because you wanted to be better at fantasy baseball, or saw it as a possible competitive edge?
No, not at all. I had really no idea that it could help. And I think folks who were deeply into sabermetrics at that time basically eschewed fantasy baseball as kind of bastardizing the whole game. So I didn't see it that way at all. It was, I think, by the third edition of the Forecaster that I found out that the folks who were buying my book were fantasy leaguers and finding an edge. And that's when I started gearing the book more towards fantasy. But an interesting side story, some of my friends, they saw me taking a lot of time from my real corporate job working on this baseball stuff, and they said, well, how long are you going to keep doing this? And so I said, well, the first Forecaster came out a month after the Mets won the World Series. Let's say I'll do this until the next time the Mets won the World Series. Lucky for you.
And you actually met Bill James at a convention of some kind, and he actually spoke to you about one of your books.
Yeah. Yeah. This story has been written about in several places, including Fantasyland and the book How James Changed Our View of Baseball. But the director's cut of that story is in this book. And basically, I was at a SABR convention, Society of American Baseball Research, in 1991 in New York. And I was first trying to get my business off the ground, so I had a table in the exhibition hall trying to sell the Forecaster. And this other smaller book with basically major league equivalent stats in it. And Bill was there, and I didn't know him, he didn't know me. And this was like 3 years after he had published his last abstract, and in that saying that he releases all his metrics out to the world. And so I said, all right, well, if he's doing that, I'm gonna try to make some money off of it, I guess. So I'm there selling basically Bill James stuff, and he comes up to my table, and quite frankly, I was quaking in my boots because I was just ready to for him to kind of give me the evil eye. And so he just stands there and he says, hello, gruff hello. And I guess I was in a bit of fanboy awe, so I just kind of stood there and watched as he's thumbing through this book, and he's looking, and he must have been there for about, I don't know, 2 minutes, but to me it felt like 4 years. And finally, he just opens the book up, and he places it down on the table in front of me, and he points to a single number, and he says, "This is wrong." And then, without saying another word, he closes the book, puts it back in the stack of books, and he just keeps walking down the exhibition hall. So, kind of looking, waiting for him to get out of my point of view, and I reopen the book and take a look, and damn, he was right. These are the days when you're doing data entry by hand, and I had mistyped the at-bats number for Atlanta-based prospect Andy Tomberlin. This is 1991. And so he shows up as with his major league equivalent batting average of 354 or something like that. And yeah, I screwed up. There's no question I screwed up. But that is the only time I've met Bill James. And yeah, so I write, I take with me to my grave the 3 words that he's ever said to me: hello, and this is wrong.
There's a joke about a guy who joins a monastery that goes very similarly to that. Let's talk about Baseball HQ, because you said in the book that your background in marketing was as important, or perhaps even more important, than your background in sabermetrics and in fantasy baseball. Why was that?
Yeah, really, that's kind of an underlying theme in the whole book. And I think it's true. I'm not a baseball insider. I never played the game. I played beer league softball in my 20s. I was a terrible player. I had no arm, had no power. I had to buy people beer in order to let me play second base. It was just...
I think the A's are looking for you.
Yes, I got that call. What was the question?
Marketing.
Marketing, yes. I turn 66 next month, so it's the brain is the first thing to go. My background is in marketing. I was in corporate marketing for a bunch of years before I started the Baseball Forecaster. My last corporate job was as director of marketing for a publishing company. And as you'll read in the book, I had a very successful career getting fired from marketing jobs. And I was not a very good employee, but I obtained a lot of skills in knowing how to market a product. And so when I first started the Forecaster and then eventually Baseball HQ, I knew how to market the heck out of these products. I was a copywriter. I knew how to design space ads. I knew how to. I was a crackerjack with direct mail programs. I mean, before email, I was one of those guys who would fill your mailboxes with junk mail. But I knew that if I could get a 2% response rate on a mailing, I'd be profitable. Well, when I started doing this stuff for my baseball, I was getting 5 to 10% response rates, and really, the revenue was rolling in and things were building pretty quickly. In fact, I forget whether it's in the book or in the outtakes, when I started trying to do the same thing with email before spam became a dirty word, that very first email, direct marketing email blast I sent out, got a 40% response rate. And I was like, well, this is the way you do business. And then, of course, my ISP shut me down. Marketing is really the key to getting the product into the hands of people who need it. And it's finding those people and designing the right message to appeal to them. It's something that I've always been very good at and clearly helped me build my business.
And it's a differentiator because there's lots of people doing the stats, but not a lot of people are combining it with that marketing acumen that, as you said, gets the news out to the people who want to know about it and then convinces them that you have it.
Yeah, and it's pretty sad actually, because I've been in this business for almost 40 years now, and I've seen some really, really good products fail because they just really didn't know how to reach their customers. And in fact, there is a short story in the book about Bill James, who tried to market a newsletter, an ancillary newsletter to his abstracts at the same time when he was at his peak popularity. And the newsletter failed because whoever was in charge of it just didn't know how to market a newsletter. And it was sad because I was a subscriber to that newsletter and it was phenomenal. Basically, all the stuff that you read in his books, he was doing in his newsletter, but more immediate analysis. So, I'd get the May newsletter and it would talk about stuff that happened in April. Whereas in his book, you'd have to wait until the following winter to read about all that stuff. So it was a shame that the newsletter failed, but it was purely a marketing problem.
the market, there was a lot of failures, as you said, but there were some guys who put out products that were actually pretty good. You and I have talked about this in the distant past, but Robert Stahl had a product that I remember using when I got into fantasy baseball. There was Steve Mann had a pretty good thing. What was the market competition like overall at that time?
At the very beginning, I mean, there weren't a lot of people in the business of doing fantasy type analysis work and writing books and newsletters and what like that. But there were a few that stood out. And so Steve Mann had a book that went out every year, and then Bob Stahl had basically his draft program. It was one of the very first draft prep programs. Rick Wilton had Fantasy Baseball Journal. Anybody here was a subscriber to Rick Wilton's Fantasy Baseball Journal back in the day? Yeah, I mean, it was a great publication. They overextended themselves, unfortunately, and then the strike hit. And in 1994 and 95, they just ran out of cash, which is also a whole chapter in the book about the strike. But John Benson was probably the most widely read fantasy writer in the 1990s, by far. Who subscribed to Benson's stuff? Yeah. John makes several appearances in the book, not always positive. He and I did not see eye to eye on a lot of things, and occasionally lawyers got involved. But yeah, he was a very prominent writer back in the 1990s.
You know, I remember those early days when I started playing fantasy baseball. I got in with a friend of mine, and we liked to talk about the game, not just play it. And I went to his house one day. He was a very successful player, and he had a newborn baby, and he was sitting on his sofa, and he said, "Oh, there's Tristan, the kid's name was." He says, "He's starting to cry. Just wait here." And as he got up to leave the couch, he grabbed a little sheaf of paper and tried to stuff it nonchalantly under a pillow. And I thought, well, it would certainly be wrong of me to see what that was. And of course, as soon as he got in the bedroom, whoosh, then it was the Ron Shandler, it was the newsletter that you were sending out by fax, if I remember, maybe even by mail.
Yeah.
And that's how I found out about Baseball HQ and the whole thing. And a couple of years later, just to finish an anecdote, I applied to join the staff, and I got onto the staff, and my audition piece was explaining how Brad Fulmer was going to be a perennial all-star, and how Ichiro Suzuki was never going to hit in the big leagues.
Well, wait a second. That's not something I assigned to you. That's the analysis that you took on, and yeah. But the analysis was phenomenal. I mean, he backed up everything with data, and blew us away and said, "Okay." I mean, at the time we didn't know whether it was going to be right or wrong, but that's how you hire good writers, is the ones who know how to do it. So we brought Patrik on, and he's kind of stuck around for a couple of decades here.
And your staff grew,
yeah.
And the BaseballHQ.com product portfolio grew. What were the key things that happened along the way during the big growth period of Baseball HQ as a product family?
Well, I mean, Baseball HQ product family. Well, I mean, obviously, you're all sitting here. When Rick Wilton's company went under, there were two products of his that I took under our umbrella because I thought they were worth saving. And one was this conference, and the other was a fax report called the Hot Sheet, which he used to fax out several times a week on thermal paper in tiny 4-point type. So that became our news feed. Basically, that was the news feed in the industry before companies like Roto News and Roto World and all those guys came on once the internet hit. This is all pre-internet. How many here played the game pre-internet? Yes. How many played the game before personal computers? Who did their stats on yellow pads? Yeah. That's history. That's why you need to read this book, because those who ignore history are doomed to repeat it. So those products built up Baseball HQ. We had some smaller, we had a website for a while called Roto HQ, which just had strategy essays. And then Derek McCamey, who was our prospect guy, started a book, The Minor League Baseball Analyst. And yeah, we grew and we grew and we grew. I mean, we peaked, I think we peaked in 2007, when that year I published 5 books. It was The Baseball Forecaster, The Minor League Baseball Analyst. John Bernstein wrote a book called The Graphical Player. Rick Wilton wrote a book on injuries, and we did a second printing of Art McGee's book, How to Value Players for Rotisserie Baseball. And we had our local first pitch events covering like 10, 12 cities we'd go to. We'd grown to a fairly large company at that point.
And by that time, the web as your delivery method had really taken primary position.
Yeah, Baseball HQ became our core product pretty quickly. We published a monthly newsletter from 1992 to 1998. In 96, when we launched Baseball HQ, the paid circulation of the website surpassed the newsletter circulation in just 9 months and never stopped. And at that point, we kept the newsletter going for about another year, and it was like, this is only representing 20% of our revenue at this point. We just got to get everybody up on the web because, with the newsletter, we're limited by postal weight limits, so we knew that we had 24 pages to be able to get under those weight limits, and that limited how much we can actually put into a newsletter. Whereas on the web, you can write for as long as you need to write, and it just offered so many more opportunities that HQ became the core.
And unlike a lot of your competitors, you actually paid your analysts and writers. What was the background in that decision, and how did you decide that you needed to pay people?
Yeah, well, a couple of things. First of all, I do have a general business philosophy that if you do work to benefit me financially, you should be compensated for it. That's just a core philosophy I've always had. I would never, ever allow somebody to write for me just for exposure for free. I don't believe in that stuff. So that was the first thing. And the second thing was, if you want to have the benefit of reading those efforts, reading that labor, you should have to pay for for that as well. So so I've always had paid products. When the internet started and everybody was giving stuff away for free, I said, look, people have been paying for this stuff now for 15 years that I've been doing this. They find value in it, willing to pay for it. They should pay for it now. I mean, the distribution system has changed. The distribution system allows distribution for free, basically, but the information still has value. So we always put a price tag on everything. And it's what kept us in business. I mean, that's what you had to do. You saw all those companies that in the late 90s, early 2000s that were giving stuff away for free and trying to generate revenue through advertising and accumulating eyeballs to their websites. Eventually, they figured out that there needs to be a pay component in order for this to work.
And over all that time, as far as I can remember, I don't ever remember you raising the price. Or the salaries, I have to say.
Well. All right.
But why did you not raise your price every so often, as most people do?
Well, I didn't know if this would work, because at the time when we launched Baseball HQ, we had our newsletter, which was published 12 times a year for $54.95, and people paid for that. And Rick Wilton had his hot sheet, which was a fax report and an email report, that people also paid $54.95 for. So that was like $110 worth of information that people were willing to pay for. All of that basically were combined to form Baseball HQ, and I said, well, I don't want to charge $110, $112 for this stuff. Let's find a price point that works. So we settled on $99. I mean, we didn't want to breach the 3-digit barrier there. So we settled on 99. We figured, all right, that'll give you a year subscription. But if you only want to subscribe for 6 months, here's a discount. If you only want to subscribe during draft season for 3 months, here's a discount. If you're willing to let us automatically charge you every year, there's a discount. Yes, that's kind of, we settled on that price point, and it worked. And there was no reason to lower it or anything. And it generated enough revenue for us to do the things that we needed to do to continue to grow the business, that I never saw the need to raise the price.
And price management is part of marketing, is it not? I remember Rick Wilton telling a story, I don't know whether it was just to me or to a group of us, but at one point before you decided on the name baseballhq.com, you had a name that you came up with that he thought maybe was ill-advised.
Well, we're designing this website, this new website, and it was the fall of 1996, and the obvious choice would be baseballforecaster.com, because everything was based on the Baseball Forecaster, but I thought that's way too many keystrokes. We got again, a marketing thing, you want to keep it as easy for people to remember and type in the name of a URL. So I was kind of bouncing ideas around in my head, and I finally landed on one. And Rick and I were working pretty closely at this point, so I sent him an email. I said, here's the prototype for the website, and here's what we need to call it. We're going to call it baseballaccess.com. And so he wrote me right back and says to me, so which one of us gets to be Mussolini? As it turned out, Rick was the one who came upon Baseball HQ, and that stuck.
And you said that the business really peaked in 2007, so you sold it.
I did.
Well, why?
Yeah, there's a whole chapter on that. Gosh, that's just that's a whole lot of stuff. The Reader's Digest version is that the business had gotten so big, and my time was being devoted to all the things that I hated about running a business, which included playing intellectual property cop, which I hate doing, but every which way I turned, people were ripping off my stuff and devaluating, all the work that at that point 50 writers were contributing to the site, and it was devaluating that stuff. So that was a real drain. There were a small handful of customers that drove me nuts. It's just like profanity-filled emails that I'd see, like, and pardon my French, but it has more impact if I just subscribed to your website for your projections. Where are your fucking projections? And I'd write back and I'd say, well, there is this big word projections in big red, bold, 50-point letters at the top of the right column. Try clicking that. And after you get 36 of those during the last week in March, when everybody is trying to get their draft prep done, it drains on you a little bit. And I didn't go looking to sell the business. It kind of fell in my lap. And I saw an opportunity and I took it, basically. And it's all described in the book. I had 3 suitors, which was pretty cool. So I got to make some choices and see my options and try to do the best thing for both the company and for my employees, because one of the suitors, which I would have loved to take their offer, which was a good offer, they basically would have discontinued this, and they would have discontinued all the books except the Forecaster, and they would have allowed me to bring maybe 10 of my 50 analysts on board. And as nice as their offer was, I said, no, I'm not interested.
You know, talking of intellectual property, I never told you the story, but a guy came to me, he was in a baseball fantasy league with me, and he said, I want to get into the content business. How do I go about it? Could I start at Baseball HQ? And I said, he asks for people every year, send in a thing, whatever, or you can start in the free area and hone your craft a little bit. Yeah, I'll do that, he says, it's easier. So he does that, and a week or two later, he says, I'd like you to look at the first thing that I put on this free website and give me some pointers and tips. I said, yeah, okay, sure. And so I read it, and I met him for coffee, and he says, well, did you read it? I go, yeah, I read it. He says, did you think it was pretty good? I said, I thought it was pretty good when I wrote it. He literally copied and pasted it off of Baseball HQ and just pasted it into the template on this other site. So I said, you have to get in touch with him, because Ron Shandler will come after your ass.
I really will. During the entire time that I ran the company, I only fired 2 people during the entire time. And one of them just couldn't meet deadlines and made all sorts of excuses, but the other one kept ripping off RotoWire. He kept taking stuff right off of RotoWire and putting into his stuff, and even after I said, I know this is from RotoWire, stop it, he kept doing it. I said, sorry, you're gone.
In the book, you concluded by noting that the competitive urge doesn't retire because the person retires. And I don't know how long after it was, but you came back with a new product, Babs Baseball. And I was thinking of that Godfather thing, you know, I thought I was out and they pulled me back in. What made you decide that retired life maybe was not as much fun as starting a whole new deal?
Well, I use a framing device in this book. And the way the book starts even, it says, hi, my name is Ron, I'm a rotoholic. And really a lot of it is about addiction, because you get addicted to this hobby, you really do. And I got addicted to the hobby, I got addicted to building a company, I got addicted to everything that came along with it. And in selling the company was my effort to kind of take a step back and realize there's other things in life. And I was starting to realize that, well, first of all, I used to be a huge hockey fan and a huge football fan, and I couldn't name 3 players on the New York Giants or the Islanders. And, it was during a time when my daughters were in the teenage years and they could have used more of a paternal presence in the house, and I wasn't there. So, I knew I needed to break away. But once I sold the company, and I thought, all right, this is a relief. Well, just like an alcoholic still has to walk by liquor stores, and still as gamblers know that Las Vegas is still there, it's hard to suppress the urge. The urge is still there to create something, to, I write in the book, every time I'd lay in bed thinking that this player who's going for $10 has to go for $25. This is a $25 player. I'd have to find 12 leagues to draft him in. And so I had to do something else. And the first thing I actually did was Shandler Park, which was a monthly fantasy league. Anybody played a Shandler Park game?
I remember.
Really? It was a great game. It tested so well. We tested it, I forget, it was 2013, 2014, and everybody loved it. I said, all right, I'm gonna roll this out. And exactly what I rolled this out was when DFS busted out, just exploded. And it just didn't have the legs to succeed. I had to shut it down after 2 years, which is unfortunate because it was a really good game. So I had to find something else. And the analytical work I've been doing at Baseball HQ, there was more. There was more that had to be done. So for HQ subscribers here, there's the Mayberry method, which I'd written about probably now almost 15 years ago. But I said there's another step beyond the Mayberry method that we have to go, and so I created the Broad Assessment Balance Sheet, BABS, and needed a home for that, so then I created Babs Baseball. And the urge doesn't go away. There's always another league to draft in, and I mean, guys, okay, be honest, how many of you here are rotoholics? Be honest. That's why you're here. Who else would drop this amount of money to come to a baseball seminar in the middle of the freaking desert? After baseball is over, you know, congratulate yourselves. I mean, we are family.
Kind of the essence of the Babs philosophy is, and you railed against this for years before you started Babs, was there was this ongoing competitive battle amongst guys in your position and websites like Baseball HQ to be more and more precise. We have the most accurate projections. And at a certain point, I remember you just said, we have to stop thinking about these things in such precise terms because they're never going to be that precise. And that was what informed Babs. And that kind of spirit of challenging things also, for instance, that's why you started Towers, was in response to some of the things that were going on in labor.
Yeah, I mean, really, it's all about the gaming experience. And back in, I think, 2010, I asked 12 of the most successful fantasy leaguers at the time in Tout Wars and Labor and the NFBC. I said, okay, here are 6 variables on what contributes to a consistently successful team. And I compiled their responses, and accurate player projections was dead last. And then, during the pandemic, we were doing some retro drafts where we knew what the players were going to do in advance. We were basically doing a draft with the actual statistics. And you would think, once you have the actual statistics, you should be able to draft a winning team. It's hard. Roster construction is hard. And that is more more important in being able to play this game well. So projections, you know, going back as far as 1993, when I started this feature in the newsletter called the Forecast 40, where I took 40 players and I chose a handful of the top analysts and said, what are your projections for these 40 players? And I just list them. And then we'd go back to it at the end of the year, and not one of us had any freaking clue. I mean, the projections were so off, and these were on players. I mean, Greg Maddux was easy to project. Paul Molitor was easy to project. But the important projections for fantasy are the ones that are not easy to project.
Andy Tomberlin.
Andy Tomberlin, yes.
And
we didn't have a clue. None of us. And to be going around proclaiming that you have the most accurate projections and using complex formulas and doing, you know, mean squared errors and all this other statistical stuff to show how your projection is better than my projection. I said, well, yeah, maybe you have a lower mean square projection than I do, but you know, try doing that over 23 roster spots and see where that gets you. It's pointless. So yeah, that was basically the underpinning of Babs and all that other work.
And the spirit of just being, well, cantankerous, frankly, with the way that the games were being run. Labor came out and Ron wrote a series at Baseball HQ, and it was 3 parts about how Tout Wars got started. And I emailed him, I said, I haven't read anything this funny. I was laughing until I was crying. And I got this terse email back saying, I wasn't trying to be funny, I was very, very mad. So what was it about labor that got you that mad that you decided to hell with it? You were going to be the guys who started the USFL.
I have to be honest, Patrick, that email that you sent me was one of the impetuses for this book, because when I read that and I thought, oh, this is kind of hitting a nerve. Maybe this is a larger story, and I knew in writing that 3-part series for HQ.
So I get a co-author credit. I see some royalties in my future.
The stories about what happened in labor that led to the creation of Tout Wars. It was just, you know, a 3-part series in Baseball HQ, but there was a bigger story there. So the bigger story is in the book. Essentially, John Hunt of Baseball Weekly had the opportunity to create a league of experts back in 1994. Jerry Heath, who ran a stat service back then, was the one who gave him the idea and offered to be the commissioner service. So John ran the first labor league, and I read all about that. And for the first few years, each year, it got more and more poorly run. And a bunch of us were like, well, you know, this this is really a public league, and it's really looking bad for us because of the way Baseball Weekly is handling it. They don't have a monopoly on an experts league. There's got to be a way to maintain the ownership of all the aspects of the league. And so a bunch of us got together and created Tout Wars in 1998. But you know, it wasn't intended to be a competitor to Labor. It was just we approached it in a different way. We wanted to have an experts league where we can experiment with different rules and maybe try to be groundbreakers and see better ways to play the game. Because from my perspective, it's all about the experience of playing the game. It's all about finding the best way to play the game that meets your group of people. You know, 12 of you may like to play rotisserie by the book, and another 12 wants to try, you know, trading Roger Clemens for, you know, a bag of beans, $12 a fab, you know, 3 future prospects, and then I want to trade them back after the season. You know, there's so many ways to play the game. There's no right or wrong, but it's all about the experience, and that's what I've always been about.
And there's quite a bit in there about the rules changes that you mentioned. You wanted Tout to be a laboratory for how rules changes might work. Vickery, you guys started using Vickery, and that stopped, unfortunately. Trading fab was allowed, $0 bids were allowed. So there was a lot of innovation going on in that space. But there was also a lot of fairly funny stuff, and one of the really funny chapters in the book is when you had a draft, all these experts from all over America, and you convened in a guy's basement.
Steve Moyer, we miss Steve Moyer. The very first Tout Wars draft was a major extravaganza in Midtown Manhattan with TV cameras and stuff. And then each year after that, the venue got smaller and smaller. And by year 4, I was afraid that Tout Wars wouldn't survive. So the first thing we did was extend invitations to a lot more experts. And so all the new internet type folk were invited to lead, players like Jason Gray and Todd Zola and Laura Michaels and John Mosey, if you remember him. They were all invited. This was the first year that they would get to be in Tout Wars, but we needed a bigger venue, and it was just too expensive to do it in Midtown Manhattan. We couldn't find a conference room. Steve Moyer offered the basement of his house in Bath, Pennsylvania. And it was quite an experience. It was the first time I met Laura Michaels, which I talk about in the book too.
Yeah, Laura Michaels, a character for sure. You later started XFL here at First Pitch, because that was in response to challenges you had issued to some of your players in Tout Wars, saying we need to draft naked, as you call it.
Well, yeah, drafting naked is a thing, especially when you're at your peak of your intellect, which unfortunately I'm not at anymore. But I thought, if we know the talent pool well enough, we don't need to have reams of paper and magazines and projections and statistics. We should just have a list of players and know what they're worth and just draft. I mean, it's, again, the roster building experience, because as much as you use projections, they're all wrong. They're all wrong. And the ADPs, they're all wrong. We use them to have a gauge of the marketplace, but they're wrong. And so, yeah, I thought we should just sit at the table and draft naked. And I offered it to the folks in Tout Wars, and they kind of, yeah, right. I offered it to Labor, no, sorry, not interested. Yeah, I thought we'd create a league here in Arizona in 2002, where we would draft naked. And our nakedness has been on display now for 22 years. We did last night again. And for those who participate in this league, you know it's a blast. It's just an absolute blast. It's basically, you're playing the table. You're looking at your competitors. You're seeing what they're trying to do, and that's the way. It's like a big poker game, and that's the way it should be. So yeah, that's fun.
Okay, the book is called Fantasy Expert. It's available here in a limited edition we heard about. Then in February sometime?
February 20th, the hardcover book comes out. So if you try to order it on Amazon, you will be ordering the hardcover that comes out in February. But like I said this morning, We've got 200 copies of the Wander Franco edition here. And I'll be in the Agua Fria room with books to sell and sign and whatever else if you have questions or things you'd like to know, I'll be glad to answer them.
Or you could ask at your local independent bookseller. They fight the power, right? Ladies and gentlemen, author Ron Shandler.